Her world was a circle, defined by the cast-iron lip of the pot she stirred. It was a world that smelled of simmering beans and wood smoke, a scent that clung to her clothes and her hair, and the deepest parts of her memory. Life was the scrape of a ladle against iron, the heft of a water bucket, the sting of lye soap on her chapped hands. She served men whose names she barely knew, men whose faces blurred into a single sun-scorched mask of casual cruelty and entitlement. They saw her as they saw the pump handle or the hitching post, a fixture, a utility, a thing that existed to serve a function. She was the bean cooker, the mender of shirts, the silent presence that absorbed their coarse jokes and their empty, hungry stares. It was a life of measured breaths and silent endurance, a careful performance of invisibility. Then he came, the one they feared, the one they watched from the corners of their eyes, the Comanche Hand. He moved with a silence that shamed their clumsy noise, and in his gaze was a stillness that seemed to draw all the chaos of the ranch into itself and quiet it. He was the only one who ever truly saw her, and one day, after the noise had ceased and the dust had settled into a new, profound silence, he would look at her across the empty expanse and offer her the one thing she had never dared to dream of. He would tell her, "This all belongs to you now." Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun was a merciless hammer over the dusty expanse of the Barlow Ranch, beating the life out of the brittle grass and cracking the earth into a mosaic of thirst. For Alara, the day began before the sun, in the pre-dawn chill when the stars still seemed sharp enough to pierce the fabric of the sky. Her first act was always the same, stoking the embers in the cookhouse stove, her movements economical, honed by years of repetition. She was a creature of routine, finding a strange, brittle safety in the familiar cycle of tasks. The great black pot was her constant companion, her altar. Into it went the beans, the salt pork, the water drawn from the well that tasted of iron and deep earth. The slow simmer was the heartbeat of her day, a rhythmic bubbling that accompanied the rise of the sun, the shouts of the cowboys, the endless, oppressive weight of the heat. They would come in from the range caked in dust and sweat, their hunger a raw, demanding thing. They ate without speaking to her, their eyes sliding past her as if she were a ghost. They would talk over her, around her, through her, their voices loud and sharp, full of the casual brutalities of men who lived by dominating the world around them. The cattle, the land, the horses, and her. She learned to read their moods in the way they slammed their tin plates on the rough-hewn table, in the timbre of their laughter, in the silence that fell when the ranch boss, Barlow, entered the room. Her own silence was a shield. It was a wall she had built brick by brick, mortared with the slights and sorrows of a past she kept locked away. Inside that fortress, she was safe. She was numb. Then Taza arrived. Barlow had hired him to track a cougar that had been preying on the calves, a task none of the other hands had the skill for. The Cowboys called him the Comanche with a sneer, their fear and resentment a palpable thing. He was different. He moved with a liquid grace that made their swaggering gait seem oafish. He was lean and hard as a whip, his face a landscape of sun and wind, his black eyes holding a depth that seemed to see right through the dusty surface of things. He never jostled for a place at the table, waiting until the others were done, taking his plate and eating alone, his back to the wall, watching. And he watched her, not with the hungry, possessive stare of the others, but with a quiet, unnerving attentiveness. He saw the tremor in her hand as she refilled a coffee cup, the way she favored her left foot, the careful way she stacked the plates to minimize the noise. He saw the person inside the shield. The days bled into one another, each a copy of the last, distinguished only by the shifting angle of the shadows and the intensity of the wind. Ilara's existence was pared down to its essentials: fire, water, iron, beans. The simmering pot was the center of her gravity, its contents the price of her keep. She measured her worth in scooped ladlefuls, in the clean plates returned to the wash bucket. She had perfected the art of being present but unseen, a skill learned in a life before this one, a life she tried to forget. It would come back to her in flashes, shards of memory as sharp as broken glass, the scent of rain on a different kind of earth, the feel of a small, trusting hand in hers, the sound of a lullaby sung in a language she no longer dared to speak. These ghosts lived in the quiet moments, in the space between the clang of the dinner bell and the thunder of boots on the porch. She would push them down, burying them under the immediate, pressing reality of her chores. Survival was a matter of staying in the present, of not looking back, of not hoping forward. Hope was a dangerous thing, a fool's currency in a world that dealt only in hard labor and harder truths. Yet, a change had begun, subtle as the turning of a season. It started with Taza. He began leaving things for her on the weathered stump outside the cookhouse door. A clutch of prairie bird eggs, their shells a delicate speckled blue. A handful of wild onions, their sharp, clean scent a stark contrast to the heavy smell of salt pork. Once a single defiant wildflower, a splash of impossible purple he'd found growing in the shelter of a rock. He never said a word, and she never acknowledged the gifts. It was a silent conversation, a language woven from gesture and observation. The other hands noticed. Their jokes took on a sharper edge, their taunts directed at the silent Comanche hand now laced with a new, possessive jealousy. They saw his quiet attention to her as a challenge, an affront to the established order of the ranch where she was their property, their convenience. One evening, a cowboy named Cale, his face flushed with cheap whiskey, cornered her by the water pump. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Getting awful friendly with the savage, ain't ya?" He'd sneered, his breath hot and foul. "Think he's gonna give you pretty things? He ain't got nothing." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. But before she could respond, a shadow fell over them. Taza stood there, materializing from the twilight as if born of it. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply looked at Cale, his eyes flat and hard as river stones. There was no overt threat, yet the air crackled with a silent, deadly promise. Cale's bravado evaporated. He let go of her arm, mumbling a curse, and shuffled away into the gloom. Taza's gaze flickered to her, a brief, questioning look, before he turned and melted back into the shadows. He had not touched anyone, had not raised his voice, but a line had been drawn in the dust, and Ilara felt something shift inside her, a tiny tectonic movement in the landscape of her soul. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was something more foundational. It was the feeling of being seen. The incident with Cale left a residue in the air, a film of unspoken tension that coated everything. The cowboys' hostility toward Taza curdled from casual contempt into something more active, more malevolent. They rode wider around him on the range, their silence more menacing than their jeers. They watched him, their eyes narrowed, searching for a weakness, an excuse. Ilara felt the shift acutely. The cookhouse, once her numb sanctuary, now felt like the dead center of a gathering storm. She found herself listening for the sound of Taza's quiet footsteps, a subconscious act of tracking his safety. Her own past began to surface with a new, insistent pressure, as if the rising tension on the ranch was pulling it from the depths. One afternoon, while kneading dough, the rhythmic motion of her hands pushing and folding, a memory broke through with stunning clarity. She wasn't in the dusty, sweltering cookhouse anymore. She was in a small, cool room with whitewashed walls. The air smelled of lavender and clean linen. Sunlight streamed through a window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A man's voice, low and gentle, was reading aloud from a book. Her husband, Daniel. His face was a blur, a casualty of time and trauma, but she remembered the sound of his voice, the feeling of his presence beside her like a warm stone. And the small hand, the one she'd remembered before, was in hers again. Her daughter, Lily. A cascade of sensations followed. The weight of Lily's head on her lap, the silken texture of her hair, the sweet, milky scent of her skin. They were safe. They were happy. It was a life so far removed from the grit and grime of the Barlow Ranch that it felt like a dream belonging to someone else. The memory shattered as the cookhouse door slammed open. Barlow stood there, his large frame filling the doorway, his face a thundercloud. "Where's the Comanche?" he boomed, his voice rattling the tin cups on the shelf. She flinched, the ghost of her daughter's hand vanishing from hers. She shook her head, unable to speak, her throat tight with the residue of her vision. Barlow's eyes, small and shrewd, scanned her face. "Don't play dumb with me, woman. You know where he goes." He took a step closer, his presence sucking the air from the room. "Some of the men think you and him are getting cozy. I don't pay you to get cozy, I pay you to cook, you remember that." His threat was plain, a reminder of her precarious position. She was a stray dog he'd allowed to stay, and the privilege could be revoked at any moment. He left as abruptly as he'd entered, leaving the door swinging on its leather hinges. Ilara stood frozen, her hands covered in flour, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The memory of her lost family, so sweet and painful, was now tangled with the raw fear of the present. The two worlds, the one she had lost and the one she endured, were colliding, and she understood, with a chilling certainty, that the quiet war being waged over her was not just about a woman and a hired hand. It was about possession, power, and the brutal lines men drew in the sand to claim what they believed was theirs. The fragile piece of her existence was over. The storm was no longer gathering, it was breaking. The silent communion between Ilara and Taza deepened, a quiet rebellion in a world of noise. Their conversations remained unspoken, but their meaning grew more profound. When he brought her a brace of rabbits, he would leave them cleaned and ready, a task the other men would have expected her to perform. When she saw his moccasins worn through at the sole, she left a small roll of cured leather and an awl on the stump, a debt repaid. These small acts were bricks in a new kind of wall, one that encircled the two of them, separating them from the resentful eyes that watched their every move. The Cowboys, led by Cale, saw this bond not as a simple kindness between two outcasts, but as a conspiracy. In their minds, her quiet dignity was defiance, and his silent respect was a challenge to their authority. They began to escalate their campaign of petty cruelties, a war of 1,000 cuts designed to break Taza's spirit and remind Ilara of her place. They would muddy the path to the well just after she'd swept it. They'd spook her chickens, scattering the flock. They took to talking loudly about what happened to squaw men and the women who lay with them, their words sharp and aimed, though they never looked directly at her. Taza absorbed it all with an infuriating stoicism. His composure was a mirror that reflected their own ugliness back at them, and it only made them angrier. He never rose to their bait, his focus remaining on his work. He'd tracked and killed the cougar, a feat that should have earned him respect, but it only deepened their fear and hatred. They saw his skill not as an asset to the ranch, but as a display of a wildness they couldn't comprehend or control. One evening, as the sky bled from orange to deep violet, Ilara watched Taza from the cookhouse window. He was in the corral, working with a young, unbroken Mustang that Barlow had given up on. The other hands had tried to break the horse with force and fury, using spurs and whips until the animal was a trembling, wild-eyed mess of terror. Taza used none of that. He moved in the round pen with a slow, deliberate grace, his body language a calm inquiry, not a demand. He didn't try to conquer the horse. He seemed to be negotiating with it, speaking a language of breath and posture. For hours, he mirrored the horse's movements, retreating when it showed fear, advancing when it showed curiosity. There was a profound patience in him, a deep understanding of fear and how to soothe it. Watching him, Ilara felt a pang of recognition. He was taming the horse in the same way he had reached out to her, with quiet respect, with an offering of peace in a world that only knew violence. It was a long, slow dance under the rising moon, a testament to a strength that had nothing to do with brute force. Finally, the horse lowered its head and took a step towards him, nudging his outstretched hand with its velvet nose. A silent surrender, a compact of trust. At that moment, Cale and two other cowboys stumbled out of the bunkhouse, drunk and spoiling for a fight. They saw the scene in the corral, and it lit a fuse. "Look at that," Cale slurred, his voice thick with malice. "The savage whispering his devil talk to the horses now. Maybe we ought to teach him a lesson in how real men do things." They started toward the corral, their intentions a dark stain on the twilight. The land held secrets. Taza knew this in his bones, in the way the wind spoke through the tall grasses and the way the rocks held the memory of the sun. This patch of earth, which Barlow called a ranch and the Cowboys called a dust bowl, had another name, a name that lived only in the stories of his grandmother. It was a place of power, a place of his ancestors. He had not come here for Barlow's wages, but for the land itself. It was a pilgrimage, a quiet act of reclamation. He had to see it, to walk it, to feel its spirit before it was completely erased by fences and cattle. One afternoon he led Ilara away from the oppressive confines of the cookhouse. He didn't ask. He simply appeared at the door and gestured with his head toward the low-lying hills to the east, an invitation that was also a command. She followed without hesitation, her trust in him now a solid, tangible thing. They walked in their customary silence, her worn boots a soft counterpoint to the near-silent tread of his moccasins. He led her to a place the cowboys never went, a small, hidden canyon carved by an ancient creek. A line of cottonwood trees grew there, their leaves a vibrant, impossible green, a testament to the water that ran just beneath the surface. It was a different world from the parched flats of the ranch. He stopped beside a large, flat rock near the dry creek bed. With the edge of his knife, he scraped away a patch of lichen, revealing a series of markings carved deep into the stone. They were not the crude brands of cattlemen. They were elegant, geometric symbols, weathered by countless seasons. "The people," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the still air. It was the first time she'd heard him speak more than a single functional word. This was a winter camp, a place of safety. He ran his fingers over the carvings, a gesture of deep reverence. He pointed to a symbol that looked like a spiral. "This means water, life." Then to another, a series of interconnected lines. "This means family, clan." He looked at her, and his eyes were not just the eyes of a tracker but of a historian, a keeper of a legacy. He was showing her the land's true face, the one hidden beneath Barlow's deed and fences. He was sharing its soul with her. This place wasn't just dirt and rock to him. It was a living history, a sacred text. And by bringing her here, he was making her a part of that story. The gesture was a profound act of trust, far more intimate than any touch. It answered a question she hadn't even known she was asking. His quietness wasn't emptiness. It was a deep reservoir of knowledge and history. His presence on the ranch wasn't a sign of subjugation. It was an act of profound, patient observation. As they stood there, a hawk circled high overhead, its cry echoing off the canyon walls. For the first time since she'd lost her family, Ilara felt a sense of belonging not to a person or a place, but to a moment in time. A shared understanding that transcended words. The sun began to dip low, casting long shadows that made the carvings on the rock stand out in sharp relief. She knew, as they walked back toward the ranch, that something had irrevocably changed. The land was no longer just a place of her servitude. It now held a secret she shared with him, a secret that gave it a new and dangerous meaning. The fragile peace of the hidden canyon could not last. As they returned to the ranch, the atmosphere was thick with a foul, simmering aggression. Cale and his two cronies, their courage fortified by whiskey and a shared sense of grievance, were waiting. They had seen Taza and Ilara leave together, and in their twisted logic, it was the final transgression. It was proof of the conspiracy they had imagined, a slight against their pride that demanded a violent response. They blocked the path to the cookhouse, their stances wide and belligerent. "Enjoy your little walk, savage," Cale spat, his eyes flicking from Taza to Ilara, lingering on her with a proprietary ugliness. "Showing the cook the sights? Or were you finding a good spot to dig for roots and berries?" The other two snickered, a raw, unpleasant sound. Taza stopped, placing himself slightly in front of Ilara. His body was relaxed, but it was the relaxation of a coiled snake, every muscle ready. He said nothing, his silence a stark contrast to their drunken noise, and this only enraged Cale further. "I'm talking to you," he shouted, taking a clumsy step forward. "On this ranch, you look a white man in the eye when he talks to you." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had seen this kind of masculine rage before. It was a wildfire, feeding on itself, seeking only to consume and destroy. She braced for the explosion, the inevitable crack of fist against bone. But Taza didn't raise his hands. He didn't shift his weight to fight. He simply held Cale's gaze, and in his eyes was not fear or anger, but a deep, unnerving pity. "Your voice is loud," Taza said, his words low and clear, cutting through the drunken haze. "But your spirit is small. It rattles inside you like a dry seed in a gourd." The insult was so unexpected, so poetically precise that it momentarily stunned Cale into silence. His face, already flushed with alcohol, turned a dark, mottled red. "Why you?" he bellowed, lunging forward, his fists swinging wildly. The attack was clumsy, predictable. Taza moved with an effortless economy, not stepping back but flowing to the side, letting Cale's momentum carry him past. As Cale stumbled, off balance, Taza's foot shot out. Not a kick but a precise trip, catching Cale's ankle. The big man went down hard, his fall ending with a wet, sickening crack as his wrist, thrown out to break his fall, bent at an unnatural angle. He screamed, a sound of pure shock and pain. The other two cowboys, who had been moving to support him, froze in their tracks. They had expected a brawl, a clumsy exchange of blows. They were not prepared for this swift, surgical dispatch. They stared at Taza, then at Cale writhing on the ground, and for the first time, the true nature of the man they had been tormenting began to dawn on them. He wasn't just a skilled tracker. He was dangerous in a way they didn't understand. His strength wasn't in his muscles. It was in his stillness, his timing, his absolute lack of fear. He hadn't fought them on their terms. He had used their own aggression, their own momentum, to defeat them. Barlow, drawn by the scream, came running from the main house, his shotgun in his hands. He took in the scene at a glance. Cale on the ground, his men frozen, and Taza standing over them, impassive as a statue. "What in God's name is going on here?" Barlow roared. Barlow's arrival did not de-escalate the situation. It merely changed its shape. The raw, physical confrontation became a battle of wills, a legalistic argument played out in the dust. Cale, cradling his broken wrist, sputtered a version of the events that painted him as the victim, ambushed by a savage. "He just attacked me, boss. For no reason. Snapped my arm like a twig." The other two men, their courage returning in the presence of their employer, eagerly corroborated the lie. Barlow listened, his shrewd eyes moving from his blubbering cowboy to the still, silent figure of Taza. He was a man who understood leverage, not justice. His ranch hands were cheap and replaceable, but Taza's skill had saved him a small fortune in lost calves. This was a calculation of assets. "Taza," Barlow said, his voice flat. "You got something to say?" Taza's gaze did not waver from Barlow's face. He seemed to look right through the man's bluster to the soft, greedy core beneath. "They were going to harm her," he said, nodding almost imperceptibly toward Alara. It was a simple statement of fact, devoid of emotion, yet it carried the weight of absolute conviction. Barlow's eyes flickered to Alara, who stood frozen by the cookhouse door. He saw her not as a person to be protected, but as a complication, a piece of property that was causing friction among his more valuable assets. "She's a cook," Barlow grunted. "She's not your concern. Your concern is what I pay you for." A long, tense silence stretched out. The sun had set, and in the deep twilight the world seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were Cale's whimpering and the low whistle of the wind through the eaves of the barn. Alara watched Taza, her own fear a distant hum beneath a new, rising tide of awe. He was not pleading his case, he was not defending himself. He was waiting. It was then that Taza played a card Barlow hadn't known was in the deck. "This land," Taza began, his voice still quiet but now imbued with an ancient authority. "It bleeds when the wrong men walk on it. The water turns sour. The calves are born weak." It sounded like a mystic's curse, and the two sober cowboys shifted nervously. Barlow scoffed. "What is that, some kind of Injun threat?" "It is a promise," Taza replied, his eyes holding Barlow's. "The promise of the land itself. You have seen it. The creek runs slower each year. The grass is thinner. You think it is drought. It is not. The land is rejecting you." He took a step closer, and for the first time, Barlow looked uncertain. "You hired me to track a cougar, but the cougar is not your real problem. Your problem is that you are a trespasser here, and your time is running out." There was no weapon in his hand, but his words were sharper than any blade. He wasn't just a hired hand anymore. He was a prophet, a force of nature, the living embodiment of the land's own judgment. He had stripped away Barlow's authority layer by layer, exposing the man's tenure as fragile and illegitimate. Barlow, a man who believed only in what he could buy and sell, was suddenly faced with a power he could not quantify or control. His bluster deflated. replaced by a cold, superstitious fear. He looked at Cale, then back at Taza, and made a business decision. He cut his losses. "Get him out of here," he snapped at the two cowboys, gesturing to Cale. "And the rest of you, get back to work." He turned without another word and stalked back to his house, the shotgun held limply at his side. He didn't fire Taza. He didn't dare. The power dynamic of the entire ranch had just been rewritten. In the aftermath, a profound and unnerving silence descended upon the Barlow Ranch. It was not the peaceful quiet of early morning, but the heavy, expectant silence of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. The next day, Cale and the two men who had stood with him were gone. They packed their meager belongings before dawn and rode out without a word, disappearing into the vast, indifferent landscape. Their absence left a vacuum, a physical and psychological space that seemed to alter the very air. The remaining cowboys moved with a new caution. They kept their voices low, their eyes down. They gave Taza a wide berth, their fear now mingled with a grudging, superstitious respect. They no longer saw him as a hired hand. They saw him as they might see a storm cloud or a rattlesnake, a powerful, unpredictable force of nature that was best left alone. The tension that had crackled for weeks had not disappeared. It had solidified into a new, unspoken order. And at the center of this new order were Taza and Alara. She continued her work, the familiar rhythms of the cookhouse a strange comfort in the shifting world. But everything felt different. The scrape of the ladle, the weight of the water, the simmering of the beans. These were no longer just the motions of survival. They felt like acts of reclamation. She was no longer invisible. She was seen, and the men's new fear of Taza had extended to her, creating a protective bubble around her. They fetched their own water. They spoke to her with a clipped, awkward politeness. One afternoon, a few days after the confrontation, Barlow himself appeared at the cookhouse. He didn't enter, just stood at the threshold, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. He looked smaller, diminished. "Looks like I'll be selling the herd," he said, not looking at her. "Moving on. This land, it soured on me." He didn't mention Taza. He didn't have to. He was a man defeated not by force, but by a power he couldn't comprehend. He left a small stack of coins on the windowsill. "For your trouble," he mumbled, and then he was gone. Over the next week, the ranch dismantled itself. A buyer came for the cattle. The remaining hands took their pay and drifted away, one by one, until the only sounds were the wind and the creak of the empty bunkhouse door. Soon, only 3 souls remained under the vast empty sky: Alara, Taza, and Barlow, who was packing his personal effects into a wagon. The day he was set to leave, the air was still and clear. Alara stood on the porch of the cookhouse, watching as he hitched his team. Taza stood near the corral, a silent, watchful statue. Barlow climbed onto the wagon seat, took up the reins, and for the first time, looked directly at Taza. He gave a short, curt nod, a gesture of defeat, of concession, of surrender. Then he snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels cutting a final set of tracks in the dust. Alara watched until it was just a small speck on the horizon, swallowed by the immensity of the plain. The silence that followed was absolute. The noise was gone. The threat was gone. The servitude was gone. All that remained was the land, the sky, and the two of them. She turned and found Taza looking at her, his expression unreadable. He walked slowly towards her, his footsteps making no sound in the soft dust. He stopped a few feet away, taking in the empty ranch, the silent bunkhouse, the vacant corral, the house with its blank windows. Then he looked at her, his gaze holding hers with a new and startling intensity. "This all belongs to you now," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap, shattering the silence and the world she had known. The words hung in the air, impossibly heavy, impossibly light. "This all belongs to you now." Alara felt them more than she heard them, a vibration that traveled from the soles of her feet up into the hollow space in her chest. She stared at Taza, searching his face for a sign of trickery, of irony, of madness. She found none. His expression was one of profound, solemn sincerity. Her first impulse was to laugh, a hysterical, broken sound. Her, the bean cooker, the ghost who haunted the edges of other people's lives, own this? This vast, harsh, beautiful, and terrifying expanse of earth. The idea was so preposterous it had no place to land in her mind. All the structures of her life, servitude, fear, invisibility, had been built on the assumption that she was worthless, that she owned nothing, not even her own safety. To be offered everything was a psychic shock, a violent reordering of her universe. She shook her head, a small, involuntary gesture of denial. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. Taza's gaze swept across the silent ranch. Barlow is gone, his men are gone. Their claim was a lie written on paper. The land's claim is real. It is written in the stone, in the water. He looked back at her. You have suffered here. You have endured. The land has seen it. Owes you a debt. It was a form of justice she had never imagined. A logic that came from a world older than deeds and fences. It was not a gift from him, she realized. He was not giving her the land. He was an emissary, a messenger, telling her what the land itself had already decided. She took a tentative step off the cookhouse porch, her boots sinking into the soft dust. The dust she had swept 1,000 times. She looked at her hands, chapped and calloused from years of labor for others. Could these hands hold a deed? Could they command a horizon? A memory, unbidden, surfaced. Not one of the traumatic ones, but a softer, more painful one. A dream she and Daniel had once shared, whispered in the dark after Lily was asleep. A small plot of land of their own. A little house with a garden. A place to be safe, to put down roots. A place where their daughter could run free. The dream had died with them, buried so deep she thought it had turned to dust itself. Now here was a version of it, resurrected on a scale so grand and terrifying, it mocked the modesty of her original hope. She began to walk, aimlessly at first, across the empty yard. She ran a hand along the rough wood of the corral fence. She peered into the dark, cavernous space of the barn, smelling the faint, ghostly scent of hay and horses. She walked to the main house, Barlow's house, and pushed open the door. It was empty, echoing, stripped of all personality, just a shell waiting to be filled, or to be torn down. The choice, she understood with a jolt, was hers. This wasn't just an offer of property, it was an offer of agency. The freedom was so absolute, so vast. It was dizzying. It was a weight, a burden of infinite possibility. For a life defined by confinement, the sudden absence of walls was its own kind of terror. She stood in the center of the empty house, the wind whistling through a broken pane of glass, and she felt the full, crushing weight of her new reality. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a servant. She was the inheritor of a kingdom of dust and sky, and she had no idea who she was supposed to be now. She walked for hours, until the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. She walked the perimeter of the fenced pasture, her hand trailing along the barbed wire, a boundary that suddenly felt porous, meaningless. She climbed the small hill behind the barn and looked out over the land that was now supposedly hers. It stretched to the horizon in every direction, a rolling sea of muted greens and browns, beautiful and utterly indifferent. From this vantage point, the ranch buildings looked small, like toys scattered by a careless child. Her entire world for the past few years, the cookhouse, the well, the bunkhouse, was just a tiny, insignificant speck in the vastness. The scale of it was overwhelming. What could one woman do with all this? Could she tame it? Could she even survive on it alone? The ghosts of her past walked with her. She saw Daniel's face in the stoic endurance of the rocks. She saw Lily's laughter in the fleeting dance of a dust devil. The dream of a garden, a home, felt both closer and more impossible than ever. That dream was for a family. It was meant to be filled with love and noise and life. What was a home without a family to fill it? Just an empty, lonely shell. As twilight deepened, she found herself back at the hidden canyon, at the rock with the ancient carvings. She sat and traced the spiral symbol with her finger. Water. Life. She looked at the symbol for family, the interconnected lines. A clan. She had no clan. She was a single broken thread. Taza found her there, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the cottonwoods. He sat near her, not too close, respecting the circle of her solitude. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars emerge, sharp and brilliant in the clear, dark sky. "I cannot do this," she said finally, her voice small against the immense quiet. "This is too much. I am not enough." Taza did not answer immediately. He picked up a small, smooth stone from the dry creek bed, turning it over and over in his palm. "When my people lost this land," he said, his voice a low murmur, "they did not cease to be. They carried the land inside them, in their stories, in their blood." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "You have lost much. I see it in you. You carry your lost home inside you. It makes you heavy, but it also makes you strong." He gestured to the vast, dark landscape around them. "This land is empty now. It needs a new story. It needs new roots. A single seed is not weak because it is alone. It is weak only if it does not try to grow." His words were not a comfort. They were a challenge. He was not offering to solve her problem, but was instead reframing it. He wasn't telling her she was strong enough. He was telling her that the attempt to be strong was what mattered. The choice was not about accepting or rejecting a gift. It was about choosing to plant herself in this new, harsh soil, or to let herself be blown away like chaff on the wind. She looked from his stoic, patient face to the endless sweep of the stars above. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time another feeling stirred beside it, a flicker of something that felt dangerously like defiance. The world had taken everything from her once. It had broken her, scattered her, and left her for dead. And she had survived. She had endured. What if survival was not the end of the story? What if it was just the beginning? She stood up, brushing the dust from her dress. She looked at Taza, the keeper of this land's memory, the man who had seen her when she was invisible. "The well in the yard," she said, her voice stronger now, clearer. "It tastes of iron. Where is the sweet water? The water for a garden?" A slow smile touched the corners of Taza's mouth, a rare and beautiful thing. He stood and pointed not toward the dry creek but further up the canyon. "It is higher up," he said. "You have to work for it. But it is there. It has been waiting."